Good morning. Welcome to another episode of Focus State. My name is Frederick. I'm joined by Modestus to talk a bit about design tokens. How are you, Modestus?
I'm doing great, thank you. It's always a pleasure to be here.
Good to hear. Nice, very nice. So we have we've spoken a bit about design tokens before in the first episode of Focus State, Approaching Design System. We spoke briefly about it. We touched upon it. But I think design tokens as a subject on its own deserves a bit more attention. And I think you agree with me. Right now, we're doing a lot of exciting stuff in this design system space. Doing some webinar stuff, we're doing some project stuff. It's very exciting. So we thought, you and I, that this would be a great opportunity to talk a bit about design tokens. Could you start with telling us a bit about design tokens, what they are, where they come from, why we're using them?
Yeah, well, I'll start by telling where they come from. So the concept of design tokens originated around 2015, and it happened in Salesforce. If you heard of Gina Ann, she has been a design system advocate since the early start of her career. And so they wanted to find a good way to coordinate with the engineering end. And design tokens was a process that they utilized.
That's very cool.
In Salesforce. So just to describe what they are and how to utilize them, I always like using this analogy. Imagine if you had like a magic box of crayon, right?
Yes.
And you take a crayon, right? It's green, and there's a label on it. It tells you to use this crayon for the grass, right? Mm-hmm. Take a yellow crayon. Okay, this one's for the sun, the blue one for the sky.
Yes.
Same as those crayons, design tokens allow us designers and developers to identify what they should be used, right? So essentially, it's just a data entities that stores a single raw design value. They're usually stored in JSON files for the sake of convenience and flexibility. From there, they can be translated to pretty much any format you can think of, right? That's why we have style dictionary, and even from Figma plugins such as Token Studio, you can choose a variety of different outputs, right?
Right.
So yeah, that's a brief explanation of what design tokens are.
That's a great explanation. That's a nice story too. I've never heard about that. But how do you then, if we look at a modern design system, I think what we would typically be using or building for our clients, for example, or when we're referencing design system, that's what we're talking about. How would you use that in a modern design system, design tokens? How do they play a role?
Well, I think design tokens is one of the main pillars of modern design system. And the reason is that, first of all, they allow us to name styling specifications consistently across the entire organization.
Right.
And that's a big one, because naming in general in design systems it's a pain in the ass. And we try to, use different methodologies to help us out with that. And design tokens play a big role in there as well.
Mm-hmm.
So besides having, shared naming conventions for your style specifications, it also allows you to do practical stuff like product theming, right?
Right.
Or white labeling.
Yes.
So in terms of product theming, right, you might have a light and dark mode.
Classic,
right?
yeah.
That's a classic use case for design tokens.
Right.
Right.
Okay.
You can specify a different value to be used based on specific condition, right? So light mode, we use dark green or light green, and dark mode, we use dark green.
Example, yeah, okay.
And so on.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so they pack a lot of value, those small design tokens.
Exactly. And they go beyond colors, right?
Yeah.
They can be used for spacing, they can be used for typography. Pretty much everything.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so pretty much anything you see in a UI could have some specific design token attached to it.
Definitely. And it also goes beyond, static designs. You can also use design tokens for specifying motion design parameters.
Like transitions and...
Yeah, duration, easing, etc.
Okay, very cool. Okay. So when this sounds like there's a lot of value, and I'm sure we're going to get back to this, but for designers and developers too. But if you look at it from a business perspective, which we like to do, see the return of investment or how it plays a role in the general organization, I hear a few themes in terms of what it could give, but can you tell us a bit about the potential business value of looking into design tokens and establishing design tokens?
Of course. So one of the major use cases that I see for businesses is actually white labeling.
Okay.
So if you want to sell a product to companies, white label product, right?
Right.
It's a perfect use case for design tokens, because same as with dark and light modes, you can have different modes for different brands.
Right.
And that allows you to define define design specifications for each brand that you want to cater to.
Right. Makes sense. Yeah, like if they have a brand color, for example. So you have a default color in the system, but company Y uses purple.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. Another good point is it also allows us to change styling specifications very fast and efficiently, right? So imagine changing a font family across the entire organization.
Mm-hmm.
Could you imagine what kind of pain in the ass that?
Yeah, I could imagine, yes.
If you have a proper design token setup, you can just change your global font family variable or the token, and that'll be pretty much it. From there, we'll have changes propagated throughout the entire organization.
That's nice.
If the setup is right.
If the setup is right, yeah. If the setup is right, something like a font family change works both for the designer and the developer, which saves time and ensures quality. That's a lot of business value. Okay. How do, in terms of designers and developers working together, design plays a huge role in that, because design is usually the first bit of anything in terms of development. How can design tokens kind of improve this relationship between designer and developer? Is there anything design tokens can do to improve this relationship or this process in between?
Definitely. So first big point is that it allows us to move the burden away, and the burden is naming styling specifications from developers to designers.
Okay.
We as designers make conscious decisions or how things, UI elements should look like.
Sure.
So having that in mind, we are the ones that should work with the naming those styling specifications.
Yeah.
And the name should somewhat reflect the use case, right? If you have developers naming those styling specifications themselves without any designer input, eventually there will be inconsistency in terms of the naming logic, and there will be a lot of code redundancy, right? So that's the first big point.
Yeah, okay.
And then the second is, again, reduced code redundancy, because now we no longer need to use hard-coded values. We can use a token, right? That just makes it more efficient to manage your code base. Another thing, another point I think is, let me just have a glance, is the automation opportunities. So in terms of automation, well, you could choose where you want to have your source of truth, right? Whether it's Figma, whether it's your Figma libraries, whether it's some external JSON, right?
Yeah.
And you could also set up a pipeline to propagate the changes, the library changes in Figma to be propagated, let's say, in that external JSON.
Right.
Which is always going to be accessible for developers.
Exactly.
Right. So again, making those styling changes becomes way faster.
Absolutely. And more consistent, yeah.
And of course, takes time to set up such pipeline.
Sure.
Also, you also need to be careful of what triggers those changes, right? There's another layer of management that you need to implement there, but it's always worth it, especially for maybe bigger organizations.
Yeah, large-scale organizations.
But even small organizations that want to move fast, right? It's something that improves that process and reduces time, and there's less manual work to be done.
Sure. That one source of truth is kind of, that's what intrigues me the most about design tokens, is that we're able to set up a space for the entire company, the entire product team, to work based on the same spacing parameters or the same typography parameters and so on. That's very interesting. So if you had to look at, we work with a bunch of different clients, and you mentioned yourself, startups or at least small organization, a large organization can see some benefits. If you were to look for the people listening too, what kind of projects would benefit from design tokens? Are there some projects that might not benefit from it, or what kind of projects would definitely benefit from implementing or looking into design tokens?
Yeah, well, I think the project that would benefit from the use of design tokens, first of all, it has to be an app that might be somewhat mature, right?
Right.
So it's just, you shouldn't be necessarily using it for proof of concept type of projects, right? But
too early.
Might be too early, right? You need that flexibility, and you can just play with hard-coded values, and that's perfectly fine.
Yeah, move.
But then, if you have to deal with, again, white labeling or maybe theming,
yes,
again, these are good indicators that you should look into design tokens.
Yeah, there's a good opportunity to look into design tokens.
Yeah,
that makes sense. And in terms of, is there anything in terms of, let's say, enterprise level software, like enterprise level applications where we see design tokens become even more crucial, or there are some opportunities for design tokens to play a role?
Of course, it becomes even more, the value of design tokens becomes even more inevitable whenever we talk about big organizations.
Yeah.
There's a lot to manage there, right? And having that single source of truth and common terminology really helps to move a little bit faster.
Yeah.
So it's, for enterprise level software, it's not even a question of theming or white labeling, just by itself, by its sheer scale. To manage that, design tokens will definitely be helpful.
Yeah, that makes sense. We're also working on a very exciting project right now where we assume, and we're looking forward to seeing the effect of design tokens in an organization that's previously not really been used to using design tokens. I don't know if you have any insights on that. You're working heavily on that project, but is there anything to be taken from that project? Any tips or tricks or anything you see?
Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, they wanted dark and light modes, right? And that was the main reason why we kind of pivoted towards this architecture. And just to enable that, we kind of had to utilize design tokens.
Right.
So it made sense since I heard that project specification, right? And it's always challenging suggesting new approaches to organizations, but I think it just in their case it was such a pleasure to work with, just because they really felt like this could save their time, and they were really on board,
Right.
So that made it so easy to suggest something new and help to implement that potential automation pipeline. Now that's not going to be necessarily the case with all of the organizations.
No.
So it just need to be able to communicate the value very clearly.
Yeah, absolutely. When we work with these different organizations, there are design tokens kind of touch on a lot of people's day-to-day and their work and their expertise, because they're for designers, they're for developers, they're for product teams, they're for quality assurance people, they're for pretty much for anybody who works on this product or software. How do you ensure that everybody kind of gets on board, like all the stakeholders involved in making these decisions, or the people at least being affected by implementing design tokens, for example? How do you make sure there is this alignment? How do you ensure that they are excited about design tokens?
This is the most tricky part. This is actually the biggest challenge in terms of design systems in general. Having people on board. How do we do that? Well, it takes time. First of all, as an individual, you need to be able to communicate the value of what you're trying to achieve, right? That's one thing. And it took me a long time to get to the place where I'm able to talk about it freely and be confident about it.
Yeah.
But then second of all, besides being able to clearly communicate the value, you also need to be able to demonstrate the value.
Yes.
And I like to think that, we should always start from ourselves. So I'm a designer, right? So I can influence how the design is being handed off to the developer.
Yeah.
And I don't want to see any hard-coded values that they will have to deal later on, right? So I start from there. I clean up my files and create a nice variable setup, right? So we should always start, from the areas that we can actually directly impact.
Right? Makes sense.
And then from there, if developers can see this is a valuable resource, okay, then we can try to take it further up the management chain.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you wouldn't necessarily go directly to the top management team to try and explain them what a design system is and what design tokens do. You want to start like on the ground, basically.
Definitely.
Demonstrate the value.
Definitely. Otherwise, it's chances are it's going to fall apart. And if it's going to fall apart, you are going to be the one to blame.
That's true.
So it's better to just another good way is to find a nice pilot project, right?
Yes.
I don't know. Maybe you're working on a new app, a new mobile app, or a new product, web-based application, whatever it is. Try to utilize it there, right? And if the team that is working on that product really likes the workflow, they will be talking about it.
That's true.
Right? They will be advocating.
And why we're not doing it like this in the plan.
Yeah. And then other product teams will suddenly be like, oh, look at what they are doing. Why shouldn't we do it? And then you can take it up to higher level management and try to implement it on throughout the entire organization. But it's super complicated. It's easier said than...
Absolutely, yeah, sure. But a pilot project, that's a good idea. So be aware, or at least be open to the idea of maybe trying to get some design token work in there, like on some smaller...
Yeah, you need to find an experiment. Like you need to find an area where you can experiment, right? Yeah. Like people are used to working the way they've been working for a long time, especially in enterprise level companies.
Sure.
Right? So you can't just apply global organization-wide changes like that, right? It doesn't work like that.
It's a process.
It's a process.
Absolutely. Hey, that's very interesting. When we speak about design tokens, obviously lives in a context of a greater design system. When we look at design systems, if we go a step back and look at the whole thing, which is huge and a lot of work and very complicated, and maybe not for everybody, how do you look at design tokens and see that as? Do you see that as the most impactful kind of area to get started, or at least look into, like fairly early on, or is there a difference too when you look at large organizations and small organizations? Is there Is there a difference in terms of design tokens being very impactful, or how do you be?
Yeah, I would say so. Actually, it's always more relevant. Like it's inevitable again.
Yeah,
The value for big organizations. There is obviously less indicators that would tell that it's good for smaller organizations, and that's because you need some sort of maintenance there, right? And you need to take time and take meetings and discuss naming conventions and in general discuss strategic stuff.
Yeah.
So for maybe startups that are just starting out, right, and they want to look into design systems, I wouldn't necessarily recommend just, fully pivoting on design tokens straight away.
Okay.
And that's also because in order for this workflow to be successful, right, you need to gain a certain amount of knowledge there.
Yeah.
And so to get it right, you need a certain level of expertise, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend diving there head first. Maybe if you're just starting out small, take a look at the component library, right?
Yeah.
That's the one tip that I would give to small companies.
Okay.
But as the companies grow, like it still becomes very, very good tool managing your design specs and making sure that consistency is there,
Right.
across every page, across every product. But, the thing is that when you're just starting out so small, the consistency is not your main concern, to be honest, right? So that being said, I think it's always more relevant for maybe scale-ups or for the companies that are preparing for the growth.
Makes sense.
Otherwise, take a look into component library. And maybe there are some exceptions, like, I don't know, we want to provide possibility to toggle between light and dark.
Sure. Yeah. That's a big...
In that case. And it doesn't have to be like it doesn't have to be necessarily design tokens, like, because design tokens, its entire strategy is not just a goddamn variable.
No,
right?
It's not.
So maybe you can just take a look at, your variable setup. Start small, Don't think too big or too broad in the beginning.
Don't stress about it, no.
Don't stress about it too much. As long as you have some sort of a nice CSS variable setup for your web application.
Yeah.
That supports theming.
Yeah.
It's fine.
Okay.
It's okay. Don't about it.
No, okay. Okay. I like that take, especially with maybe another focus area being component libraries being more valuable, at least initially for some.
Yeah.
Right.
And in a lot of cases, right, companies would hire consultants to help them to manage stuff like that.
Sure.
Of course, like the companies like, I don't know, Atlassian or Salesforce, they have an insane design culture there, right? So they might develop something like that in-house.
Yeah, sure.
But a lot of companies don't have that luxury, right? So they have to hire consultants and just people that have a good level of expertise to be able to advise on matters like that.
Definitely. It is a different ball game. It's not just, we make it sound very simple, you do.
Yeah, we do. And a lot of people will tell you, oh, well, what is the difference between design token and a variable?
Sure. Exactly.
Right? It's the same as asking what is the difference between responsive design and a media query.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, there are some misconceptions and there are some different opinions there. But yeah, they are quite... Getting it right is a strategic process, which, as you said, requires meetings, requires sit-downs with developers, close relationships.
Yes.
Yeah, it's very time-consuming, but the return of investment should be there. That's at least what we see in terms of more efficiency or better user experience.
Definitely.
Higher satisfaction. Okay, I think in terms of design tokens, I think we've been around. There's many ways to talk about design tokens. There's a lot to be said, but I think generally we've touched upon most of it, like most of the interesting bits. if we had to look at you from a designer perspective, as you mentioned yourself, you're a designer. Can you give any advice for the designers listening in terms of how you would approach working with design tokens, or how in general you would look at design tokens from a designer perspective? I think that could be interesting to hear your take on that.
Yeah, well, assuming that you know enough about the design tokens to get started, I would say naming is probably the most important bit of it. And so
naming the variables or naming the design,
naming the tokens. Yeah. So finding that good logic that works across the development teams and design teams and the product team, right? Like finding that naming logic that works for everybody is a tough challenge, right? So you should always ask for opinions, right? So I do believe that we as designers, it's our responsibility to be conscious of our design decisions, and that's what design tokens are for, right? Just basically placing a label on that hex code and saying, well, we're using because we want to signal error, right?
Right.
So, yeah, just obviously it's our responsibility, but we should fine-tune it based on other people's opinion.
For sure, yeah, include people.
You have to be inclusive in there. And then another one, maybe.
Is there anything in terms of, you mentioned colors, like primitive and semantic colors. Is there anything that's important to mention there? Because that's the discussion we have. We talk about it at the office quite a lot.
There's a lot to talk about there, because now we're touching the architecture, right? So we haven't really covered the common architecture, right?
We haven't.
That tiered token system,
no,
or those layers.
I don't think we have time for that.
But in general, I'll just briefly go through.
For sure.
In general, we have tier 1 layer that is primitive or core or global layer. So it's just a bunch of building blocks, and you have as many as you might need in the future, right? Sure. You just basically have a bunch of Lego pieces or bunch of crayons, if you might say, right? And you want to have a good amount of options there that is going to allow you to sustainably build your UIs and components and expand upon it.
Yes.
Then you have semantic layer. So this is the layer where we say, okay, the core layer would say maybe purple 500, but the semantic layer would say button primary.
Right.
And then you have like even a third layer, which is component specific. So again, majority of UI should be covered with the semantic layer. Like 90% of what you see in that screen should be covered with the semantic layer. But sometimes, especially when we're dealing with the theming, you want to make exceptions, right? And that's why this component layer is for. A lot of people would argue that you cannot even implement it properly without the third component layer. But I think that it's for smaller organizations, it's not really a necessity.
Okay.
As long as you get the semantic layer right. So knowing that, keeping that in mind, right? So you have the first layer that is just a bunch of building blocks. Try to keep the semantic layer as slim as possible.
Okay.
So it's better to start small and keep expanding on it.
Yeah.
Right? So don't have too many size variables or size tokens for your typography scale.
No.
Like, don't have the tokens that you are not using. It's better to start with 5 tokens and then slowly add more as you need more, right? And as soon as the need arises, okay, we'll add them.
Makes sense.
But then it's a pain in the ass to deal with bloated bloated semantically.
That makes sense, both for the designer and the developer.
Both for the designers and developers, and especially for designers when you're just going through your variable picker in Figma. It's a bit annoying, right? You can obviously, if you're very familiar with your token architecture, you can search based on naming, and that can be quick, but still, especially the people that are not necessarily onboarded on the project, right? Or you're onboarding them on this new project. It's easier for everybody to keep it slim.
Absolutely.
As slim as possible.
Yeah, the semantic layer. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
I think the exercise we've been doing recently, at least on the project we're working on right now, is typically, if you haven't begun looking into design tokens or design system or anything related to this, you probably started somehow. But you probably also have some design already. So what we did recently, and correct me if I'm wrong, or add to it if you have something, we go through the visual, like the UI we've already built, designed, and the stakeholders love it, and it's all good. Then we kind of, we do the reverse. Like we kind of pick out, we create the tokens and variable and the semantic structure and everything based on the design we've already done. And then maybe we'll make some small design changes just to fit the new structure. So we don't bloat the layer, the semantic layer, but we kind of do the reverse. So we don't start by building out the semantic layer just out of thin air. We have some design to attach it to. Exactly.
It should never be made up out of thin air. You should always have a reference. And that's why I mentioned pilot project.
Yeah.
So for us, it was a pilot project. We've designed something new for our client. They loved it. Okay. Well, now we take it from there. Now we do a little audit. We go through the UI that we've designed. We identify potential tokens that are going to be reused elsewhere, right? Most commonly used stuff like for container width, right? Or, I don't know, the shadows that we use.
Yes.
Border radius values that we're reusing constantly.
Yes.
Padding,
yeah,
space,
exactly.
All that jazz.
Yeah.
Do a little audit, note it down.
Yes.
And they're even actually like doing that. While I was doing that, I found Figma plugins that tell you the amount of layers that are using this specific value, right? So you can even...
That's nice.
Yeah.
Okay.
There are fast and easy ways to do that audit. It's just...
Very nice. Do you have anything else to add to the subject of design tokens?
No, I don't think that I have. I think we covered it pretty well.
I think so too. Okay.
Already expanded way more than I wanted to in the previous question.
I think that's good.
With that architecture.
Yeah, but I think that's kind of the interesting part too, because that is the foundation of all the things you started to talk about. Like, a good foundation is very important.
Yes.
So I think that's nice to have it in there too. Well, I think we can wrap up this episode of Focus State, focused on design tokens. Thank you very much for joining.
Thank you for having me.
Sharing your expertise as usual. Thank you for listening. Give it some love if you like this episode. I think Felipe behind the camera, thank you for joining too. The making sure everything works and the light and everything, and we're looking good. I think that helps us a lot in terms of following the podcast on Spotify and giving it a rating of some sort that fits with whatever you got out of it. I think that's it.